The sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and orange as it rose over Ouagadougou, the bustling capital of Burkina Faso. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of a city awakening, motorbikes rumbling to life, vendors calling out their wares, children laughing on their way to school. But inside the presidential palace, a different kind of energy stirred. President Ibrahim Traore stood at his office window watching the city come alive. At 34, he was one of Africa's youngest leaders, having risen to power through a military coup that promised change for the people of Burkina Faso. His dark brown uniform was pressed and neat, his bearing confident yet thoughtful. But today, something weighed heavily on his mind. For weeks, reports had crossed his desk about the conditions in the nation's prisons: overcrowding, poor sanitation, and stories of forgotten inmates languishing without trial. These weren't just statistics to him. They represented real people, real lives that his government was responsible for protecting. "Cancel my morning meetings," he told his aide, a young man named Joseph, who had served him faithfully since taking office. "I want to make an unscheduled visit." Joseph looked puzzled. "Where to, Mr. President?" "To the central prison." "And tell them nothing, no preparation, no warnings. Just arrange a simple escort." The aide's eyes widened. Presidential visits were typically planned months in advance, with security sweeps, media coordination, and careful staging. This was unprecedented. "Sir, the security protocols." "Will be fine," Traore interrupted gently but firmly. "Sometimes a leader must see his nation as it truly is, not as it's presented to him." Within an hour, a modest convoy of 3 vehicles left the palace gates. The president sat in the middle car, watching the familiar streets of his capital city pass by. He saw the markets bustling with activity, the schools where children played during recess, the mosques where the faithful gathered for morning prayers. But he also saw the poverty, the children with no shoes, the elderly begging for coins, the young men with no work standing idle on street corners. As they drove further from the city center, the buildings became smaller and shabbier. The roads grew dustier, and the sounds of prosperity faded. After 40 minutes, they arrived at their destination, Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility. The prison loomed before them like a fortress of despair. High concrete walls topped with razor wire stretched around a compound that looked more like a forgotten relic than a place of rehabilitation. The paint was peeling, the gates were rusted, and an oppressive silence hung over everything. The guards at the main gate nearly dropped their weapons when they recognized the presidential vehicle. One of them, a young man barely out of his teens, stammered as he approached the car window. "Mr. President, we weren't expecting." "I know," Traore replied calmly, stepping out of the vehicle. "That's exactly why I'm here." Word of the president's arrival spread through the facility like wildfire. Prison warden Pascal Ouedraogo, a short, stocky man in his 50s, came running from his office, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. "Mr. President," he gasped, trying to catch his breath, "if we had known you were coming, we would have prepared a proper reception. The facility could have been cleaned. The inmates could have been—" "Warden Ouedraogo," the president interrupted, his voice gentle but authoritative, "I'm not here for a show. I'm here to see the truth. Take me to the prisoners." The warden's face went pale. He knew the conditions inside were far from what any visiting dignitary should see, especially not the President of the Republic. But he had no choice but to comply. They walked through the main entrance into a world that seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. The corridors were narrow and dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent bulbs casting eerie shadows on cracked walls. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food, and human waste. Somewhere in the distance they could hear voices, some shouting, some crying, some singing softly to themselves. "How many inmates are currently housed here?" the president asked as they walked. The warden consulted a worn clipboard. "Approximately 800, sir." "And the facility's capacity?" A long pause. 350, sir." The president stopped walking and turned to face the warden. "More than double capacity. How long has it been like this?" "Several years, Mr. President. We've requested additional funding for expansion, but bureaucracy moves slowly while human beings suffer," Traore finished. "Show me the main housing area." The main prison block was a sight that would haunt President Traore for the rest of his life. Hundreds of men were crammed into spaces meant for half their number. Some sat on thin mats on the concrete floor, playing cards with pieces of torn cardboard. Others lay curled against the walls, their eyes vacant and hopeless. A few stood at the barred windows, grasping the metal bars as they stared out at a world they hadn't touched in years. As the president entered the main block, a strange silence fell over the block. Word had somehow spread that this wasn't just another inspection by prison officials. The men began to stand, uncertain whether to show respect or suspicion. Many had been forgotten by the world outside these walls for so long that the idea of anyone caring about their existence seemed impossible. President Traore walked slowly through the block, making eye contact with as many inmates as he could. He stopped frequently to ask questions. "What's your name? How long have you been here? Do you have family? Have you had a trial?" The responses varied, but a disturbing pattern emerged. Many men had been imprisoned for years without seeing a judge. Others had been convicted on flimsy evidence or coerced confessions. Some didn't even remember exactly what they had been charged with. The paperwork had been lost or never properly filed. One elderly man, his hair white with age and worry, grabbed the president's sleeve as he passed. "Sir," he whispered urgently, "I have been here for 12 years. My grandson was born while I was locked up. I have never seen him. They said I stole a goat, but the goat was found alive in another village 3 days after my arrest. No one would listen." The president stopped and looked into the man's eyes. They were clear and honest, filled with pain, but not with the hardness he expected to see in a career criminal. "What's your name?" "Amadou Sawadogo, sir. I was a farmer in Kugudu. I had a small plot where I grew millet and sorghum." The president made a mental note of the name and continued his journey through the block. Each story was more heartbreaking than the last. Young men who had been arrested during protests and forgotten in the system. Fathers who had been imprisoned for debts they couldn't pay. Sons who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it was in the far corner of the block, in a small, dingy cell meant for one person but housing 3, that President Traore encountered the man who would change everything. Emmanuel Caboret sat with his back against the concrete wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. Unlike the other prisoners who had stood when the president entered, Emmanuel remained seated, his head bowed as if in prayer or deep contemplation. He was thin, too thin, and his clothes were little more than rags held together by hope and necessity. There was something about his stillness that drew the president's attention. While other inmates had reached out to tell their stories, Emmanuel seemed lost in his own world, as if he had retreated so far into himself that the outside world could no longer touch him. "What about him?" President Traore asked the warden, nodding toward Emmanuel. The warden glanced at his clipboard and frowned. I'm not sure, sir. He's been here for quite some time. Very quiet, never causes any trouble." The president approached the cell and knelt down so he was at eye level with the seated man. "What's your name, brother?" Emmanuel looked up slowly, as if surfacing from deep water. His eyes were the saddest the president had ever seen, not angry or bitter, but filled with a profound exhaustion that came from years of carrying unbearable weight. "Emmanuel," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been here, Emmanuel?" The man was quiet for a long moment, as if calculating not just years, but the weight of each day. 7 years, he finally answered. 7 years, the president repeated the words, letting their significance sink in. "What were you accused of?" Emmanuel's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "They said I stole money from my employer, 50,000 CFA francs from the company safe." "Did you?" Emmanuel met the president's eyes directly for the first time. "No, sir. I worked for Monsieur Laurent Guerra for 8 years. I was his bookkeeper. I managed his payroll, handled his correspondence. I was loyal to him." "Then why did he accuse you?" "Because he wanted to give my job to his nephew, and he needed a reason to get rid of me. The money was never missing. He moved it to another account and claimed it was stolen. I had no lawyer, no one to speak for me. The judge believed him because he was rich and influential, and I was just a poor clerk." The president studied Emmanuel's face as he spoke. There was no deception in his words, no shifting eyes or nervous gestures that might indicate lying. Just a man telling a painful truth he had carried alone for 7 years. "Did you try to appeal the conviction?" Emmanuel's laugh was bitter and hollow. "With what money, sir? My wife left me 6 months after I was imprisoned. She took our children and went back to her family's village. I haven't heard from them since. I have no one on the outside, no one to fight for me." The president felt something stir in his chest, a mixture of anger at the injustice and compassion for this forgotten man. He had heard dozens of stories that morning, but something about Emmanuel's quiet dignity in the face of such profound betrayal moved him deeply. "I believe you, Emmanuel." The words hung in the air like a sacred promise. The warden gasped audibly, and the other prisoners in the cell stared in shock. No one in authority had ever said those words to Emmanuel before. Emmanuel's eyes filled with tears. "Sir?" "I said I believe you, and I'm going to find out what really happened to you." The ride back to the presidential palace was conducted in complete silence. President Traore stared out the window, but he wasn't seeing the familiar streets of Ouagadougou. Instead, he kept seeing Emmanuel's face, the exhaustion, the dignity, the faint flicker of hope that had appeared when someone finally said they believed him. Back at the palace, the president immediately summoned his Minister of Justice, Yakuba Ouedraogo, no relation to the prison warden. Minister Ouedraogo was a seasoned lawyer in his 60s who had served under 3 different administrations. He prided himself on understanding the intricacies of Burkina Faso's legal system better than anyone else in government. "Yakuba," the president said without preamble as the minister entered his office, "I need you to pull the case file on a man named Emmanuel Traore. He was convicted 7 years ago of theft from his employer, a man named Laurent Guerra." The minister looked puzzled. Sir, may I ask why you're interested in this particular case? Because I have reason to believe an innocent man has been rotting in prison for 7 years while we've been too busy with politics to notice. The minister shifted uncomfortably. Mr. President, with respect, the courts handle thousands of cases each year. We can't second-guess every conviction. We can and we will when there's evidence of a miscarriage of justice, the president interrupted. I want that file on my desk by tomorrow morning, along with a complete review of how the case was handled. That evening, President Traore couldn't focus on his usual duties. He tried to review budget proposals and diplomatic cables, but his mind kept drifting back to the prison. He thought about Emmanuel, sleeping on a concrete floor for the 2,566th night, still maintaining his innocence to walls that couldn't respond. But he also thought about the other men he had met that day. Amadou, the farmer accused of stealing a goat that was later found alive. The elderly man who had missed his grandson's entire childhood over a crime he might not have committed. How many others were there? How many voices had been silenced by poverty, corruption, or simple bureaucratic incompetence? The next morning, Minister Ouedraogo arrived at the president's office carrying a thin manila folder. His expression was grim. "Well?" the president asked. "Sir, I've reviewed Emmanuel Cabaret's case file, and I'm afraid there are irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "The investigation was completed in less than 48 hours. There was no forensic examination of the company's books. Emmanuel was not provided with legal counsel. The record shows he waived his right to a lawyer, but there's no indication anyone explained what that meant." The president picked up a document and scanned it. "This confession, it's not in his handwriting." "No, sir. It appears to have been transcribed by the investigating officer. Emmanuel signed it, but—" "But what?" But according to the medical report filed after his arrest, Emmanuel had 3 broken fingers on his right hand and severe bruising on his torso. The report was filed by the prison medical officer, but there's no indication anyone investigated how those injuries occurred. The president's jaw tightened. "He was tortured into signing a confession." "It appears so, sir, and there's more. The judge who heard the case, Honoré Pinda, was removed from the bench 2 years later for accepting bribes in other cases." "My God!" The president leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the injustice. "What about the employer, this Laurent Guerra?" "He's become quite wealthy since then. His business has expanded significantly. He now owns 3 companies and has considerable political influence." President Traore stood up abruptly and walked to his window. Outside, life continued as normal in Ouagadougou. People went to work, children attended school, families shared meals together. But somewhere in the city, Emmanuel sat in a cell, paying for a crime he didn't commit, while the real perpetrator lived in luxury. "I want a complete investigation," he said finally. "Form a special commission, independent lawyers, investigators from outside the Justice Ministry, and representatives from human rights organizations. I want Emmanuel's case reviewed from top to bottom." "Sir, that will require significant resources, and it might send the wrong message about our justice system." "The wrong message," the president turned to his minister. "Yakuba, let me be very clear about what message I want to send. I want every corrupt judge, every lazy investigator, and every powerful person who thinks they can destroy an innocent life to know that this administration will not tolerate injustice. I don't care if it embarrasses the Justice Ministry. I don't care if it makes us look like we don't trust our own system, because right now, I don't trust our system, and neither should you." The Special Commission began its work immediately. Led by Ibrahim Traore, a respected human rights lawyer, the team included forensic accountants, former judges known for their integrity, and investigators from the National Police's Anti-Corruption Unit. Their first stop was Guerra's business office in the commercial district of Ouagadougou. Guerra Enterprises occupied a modern three-story building with gleaming windows and a security gate. It was the kind of success story that politicians typically celebrated, a local businessman who had built a thriving company that employed dozens of people. But as the investigators dug deeper, a different picture emerged. They discovered that Guerra had a pattern of accusing employees of theft when he wanted to avoid paying them severance, or when he needed scapegoats for his own financial manipulations. Emmanuel was just one of at least 6 men who had been imprisoned on theft charges brought by Guerra over the past decade. The forensic accountants made an even more disturbing discovery. The 50,000 CFA francs that Emmanuel was accused of stealing had never actually gone missing. Bank records showed that Guerra had transferred the money to a personal account 3 days before reporting the theft. He had then used Emmanuel's imprisonment to avoid paying him 6 months of back wages and accumulated vacation time. When confronted with this evidence, the corrupt judge, Honoré Kinda, broke down and confessed. From his own prison cell, he was serving time for the bribery charges that had removed him from the bench. Kinda admitted that Guerra had paid him 25,000 CFA francs to ensure Emmanuel's conviction. He said, "I knew the case was weak. There was no real evidence, but Guerra was persistent and he offered money I desperately needed. My own daughter was sick and I needed to pay for her medical treatment. I told myself it was just one case, that Emmanuel was probably guilty of something even if we couldn't prove this particular crime." The investigation also revealed how Emmanuel's confession had been obtained. The arresting officer, now retired, admitted under questioning that Emmanuel had been beaten for 3 hours before he agreed to sign the document. The broken fingers were deliberate, a way to ensure his signature would be shaky and hard to analyze later. "We told him his family would be harmed if he didn't cooperate," the former officer admitted. "It was wrong, but we were under pressure to close the case quickly. Guerra had connections to politicians who wanted the matter resolved." As the evidence mounted, President Traore felt a mixture of vindication and rage. He had been right to trust his instincts about Emmanuel's innocence, but the depth of the corruption and cruelty involved was staggering. "How many others?" he asked Mariam Ouedraogo when she presented the commission's preliminary findings. "That's the question we're afraid to answer, Mr. President. If we found this much corruption in one case we investigated thoroughly, what might we find if we looked at hundreds more?" That night, President Traore made a decision that would transform not just Emmanuel's life, but the entire justice system of Burkina Faso. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility when President Traore returned, this time with a convoy of vehicles carrying journalists, lawyers, and court officials. But his first stop was the same small cell where he had met Emmanuel a week earlier. Emmanuel was sitting in the same position, as if he hadn't moved since the president's last visit. But when he looked up, something in his eyes had changed. Hope, tentative, and fragile, but unmistakably there. "Emmanuel," the president said, kneeling down beside the cell bars, "I told you I would find out the truth." "Yes, sir." "And have you?" The president pulled out a document bearing the official seal of the Republic of Burkina Faso. "You were framed, Emmanuel. Laurent Guerra stole his own money and blamed you to avoid paying your wages. The judge was bribed. The police officers beat you into signing a false confession. You have been innocent all along." Emmanuel stared at the document, but the words seemed to swim before his eyes. 7 years of maintaining his innocence, 7 years of being called a liar and a thief, 7 years of wondering if he was going insane, and now vindication. What does this mean?" he whispered. "It means you're free, Emmanuel. It means you're going home." The cell door swung open for the first time in 7 years. Emmanuel stood up slowly, his legs unsteady after so long in confinement. As he stepped out of the cell, every prisoner in the block began to cheer. The sound echoed off the concrete walls like thunder, a collective roar of celebration for one man's liberation and hope for their own. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered. Word of Emmanuel's release had spread through social media and radio broadcasts, and hundreds of people had come to witness this unprecedented moment. As Emmanuel emerged into the sunlight, blinking and overwhelmed, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. President Traore placed a protective arm around Emmanuel's shoulders and led him to a microphone that had been set up for the press conference. "Citizens of Burkina Faso," the president began, his voice carrying clearly through the loudspeakers. "Today we correct a terrible injustice. This man, Emmanuel Traore, has spent 7 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. He was failed by our police, failed by our courts, and failed by our system of justice." The crowd listened in rapt attention as the president outlined the corruption and incompetence that had led to Emmanuel's wrongful imprisonment. "But Emmanuel's release is not enough," the president continued. "We must ensure that this never happens again. I am announcing today the creation of Operation Justice Light, a comprehensive review of every prisoner in Burkina Faso who has been incarcerated for more than 2 years without a conviction or more than 5 years with questionable evidence." The announcement sent shockwaves through the country. No African leader had ever undertaken such a systematic review of their justice system, and many wondered if President Traore truly understood the magnitude of what he was proposing. But for Emmanuel, standing in the sunlight for the first time in 7 years, the broader implications would come later. For now, he was simply overwhelmed by the reality of freedom. When a reporter asked him how it felt to be vindicated, he could barely speak through his tears. "I never stopped believing in the truth," he said finally, "but I had stopped believing anyone would listen. President Traore listened. He saw me when I had become invisible to the world." In the days following his release, Emmanuel struggled to adapt to life outside prison. The world had changed dramatically during his 7-year absence. Smartphones were everywhere. Social media had transformed how people communicated, and even the physical landscape of Ouagadougou had evolved with new buildings and roads. President Traore had arranged for Emmanuel to stay in a government guest house while he readjusted to freedom, but the transition was more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Emmanuel had panic attacks in crowded places, couldn't sleep without the familiar sounds of the prison block, and found himself overwhelmed by simple choices like what to eat or what clothes to wear. Recognizing Emmanuel's struggles, the president arranged for him to meet with a counselor who specialized in helping former prisoners reintegrate into society. Dr. Aminata Traore, no relation to the president, had worked with political prisoners and others who had been wrongfully detained. "What you're experiencing is normal," she explained during one of their sessions. "You've been living in a controlled environment for 7 years. Your brain has adapted to that reality. It will take time to readjust to making your own decisions and navigating the complexities of the outside world." But even as Emmanuel worked to heal from his trauma, he found himself drawn to a larger purpose. During his recovery, he had been following news coverage of Operation Justice Light, and he was amazed by what President Traore's team was discovering. The initial review had identified over 300 prisoners who appeared to have been wrongfully convicted or were being held without proper legal procedures. Some cases involved corruption similar to Emmanuel's, but others were the result of incompetence, lost paperwork, or simple bureaucratic neglect. One case particularly resonated with Emmanuel. A young man named Jacob Wendrogo had been arrested at age 17 for allegedly participating in a protest that turned violent. But the record showed that Jacob had been at school during the protest, and several teachers were willing to testify to his whereabouts. He had been imprisoned for 8 years without a trial, simply forgotten in the system. "I want to help," Emmanuel told President Traore during one of their regular meetings. "These people, I understand what they're going through in a way that lawyers and officials can't. I've lived it." The president had been hoping Emmanuel would make this offer. "Are you sure? It would mean visiting prisons, reliving some of your own trauma, confronting the very system that failed you?" "That's exactly why I need to do it," Emmanuel replied. "For 7 years, I prayed that someone would come for me, that someone would listen to my story and believe me. Now I can be that person for others." And so Emmanuel became the public face of Operation Justice Light. President Traore appointed him as special advisor on prison reform and wrongful convictions, a position that had never existed before but was desperately needed. Emmanuel's first official act was to return to Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility, not as a prisoner, but as an advocate. Walking through the same corridors where he had spent 7 years of his life, he now carried a clipboard and had the authority to review cases and recommend releases. The prisoners' reactions to seeing him were extraordinary. Many remembered him from his time there, but seeing him free and in a position of authority was like witnessing a miracle. Word spread quickly through the facility that Emmanuel had not only gained his freedom, but was now working to help others achieve theirs. "If it happened to Emmanuel, it can happen to us," became a common refrain among the inmates. As Operation Justice Light expanded across Burkina Faso, Emmanuel found himself traveling to prisons in every region of the country. Each facility told a similar story of overcrowding, poor conditions, and forgotten souls trapped in a system that had lost sight of its purpose. In Bobo Dioulasso, the country's second-largest city, Emmanuel discovered a man named Seydou, who had been imprisoned for 12 years for allegedly stealing livestock. But the investigation revealed that Seydou's crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been walking by a farm when animals went missing, and his inability to prove his whereabouts had been enough to convict him in a system more concerned with closing cases than finding truth. In the northern city of Wahigea, Emmanuel met Fatima, one of the few women in the prison system. She had been convicted of murdering her husband, but the evidence suggested she had actually been defending herself from domestic violence. No one had investigated the history of abuse, no one had spoken to neighbors who had heard her screams, and no one had questioned why a woman with no history of violence would suddenly become a killer. Each case was a story of systemic failure, but they were also stories of resilience and hope. As word of Emmanuel's work spread, prisoners began to believe that their voices might finally be heard. They started writing letters, not just to Emmanuel, but to newspapers, human rights organizations, and their own families they had lost contact with years earlier. As Emmanuel worked to correct the injustices he encountered, he became a symbol of hope for a nation struggling to reconcile its past and build a brighter future. His own story, a story of ups and downs, of forgotten destinies and rediscovered aspirations, was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for redemption, for justice, and for humanity. The impact extended beyond the prisons themselves. Families who had given up hope of ever seeing their loved ones again began to come forward with information that could help clear their names. Communities started to pay attention to what was happening in their local courts and police stations. President Traore watched these developments with growing satisfaction, but he also recognized the challenges ahead. The operation was uncovering so much corruption and incompetence that it threatened to overwhelm the justice system's capacity to process cases fairly and quickly. "We need to think bigger," he told Emmanuel during one of their weekly meetings. "It's not enough to free the wrongfully convicted. We need to rebuild the entire system so this doesn't happen again." Emmanuel nodded. I've been thinking the same thing. But how do we change something so fundamental? We start with the people, the president replied. We train new judges who understand that their job is to find truth, not to process cases quickly. We reform the police so they investigate crimes properly instead of just finding someone to blame. We create legal aid clinics so poor people can get representation, and we make sure the public understands their rights so they can't be taken advantage of. The conversation led to the creation of the National Justice Reform Initiative, a comprehensive program that would take years to implement, but promised to transform how justice was administered in Burkina Faso. As Operation Justice Light continued to uncover cases of wrongful imprisonment, it inevitably began to focus on the people who had created these injustices. The investigation into Emmanuel's case had already led to charges against Laurent Guerra and the corrupt judge who had convicted him, but they were just the beginning. The review revealed a network of corruption that extended throughout the justice system. Some police officers routinely beat suspects into confessing to crimes they hadn't committed. Certain judges could be bought for surprisingly small amounts of money. Prosecutors cared more about their conviction rates than about whether the people they were convicting were actually guilty. President Traore faced a difficult decision. He could quietly retire the worst offenders and try to reform the system gradually, avoiding the public scandal that would come with full disclosure, or he could expose the entire network of corruption, knowing it would shake public confidence in the justice system but also create pressure for genuine reform. He chose transparency. The trials of corrupt officials became national events, broadcast on television and radio throughout Burkina Faso. Citizens watched in fascination and horror as the depths of corruption were revealed. They learned how their tax money had been wasted, how innocent people had been imprisoned, and how the wealthy and connected had literally been able to buy their way out of justice. The most dramatic moment came when Laurent Guerra himself was put on trial. The man who had destroyed Emmanuel's life sat in the same courthouse where Emmanuel had been wrongfully convicted 7 years earlier. But this time, the proceedings were fair. The evidence was properly presented, and justice had a chance to prevail. Emmanuel chose to attend every day of the trial. He sat in the front row, not out of hatred or a desire for revenge, but as a witness to the triumph of truth over lies. When Guerra was finally convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison, Emmanuel felt no joy, only relief that no one else would suffer as he had. After the verdict, reporters asked Emmanuel how it felt to see his tormentor brought to justice. "I don't see him as my tormentor," Emmanuel replied thoughtfully. "I see him as a man who made terrible choices and now must face the consequences. I forgive him, but that doesn't mean he shouldn't be held accountable for what he did." The grace and dignity Emmanuel showed in that moment became symbolic of the entire reform movement. This was not about revenge or punishment for punishment's sake. It was about creating a system where truth mattered more than power, where justice was available to all citizens regardless of their wealth or connections. 2 years after Emmanuel's release from prison, Operation Justice Light had freed over 800 wrongfully convicted prisoners and exposed corruption that led to the prosecution of dozens of officials. But President Traore and Emmanuel knew that clearing past injustices was only half the battle. The real challenge was building a system that wouldn't create new injustices. The National Justice Reform Initiative began with the most basic element: education. Law schools throughout the country reformed their curricula to emphasize ethics and human rights alongside legal procedures. Police academies introduced courses on proper investigation techniques and the rights of suspects. Even judges, many of whom had been operating under outdated procedures for decades, were required to attend refresher courses on constitutional law and proper courtroom procedure. Emmanuel played a crucial role in these educational efforts. His story had made him famous throughout West Africa, and he used his platform to speak at universities, police stations, and community centers about the importance of justice and human rights. "I'm not here as a victim," he would tell his audiences. "I'm here as a survivor who wants to make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else. But that's not just the government's responsibility, it's our responsibility. Every citizen has a role to play in protecting justice." The reform initiative also created practical changes that would have immediate impacts. Legal aid clinics were established in every major city, staffed by young lawyers who were committed to representing poor defendants free of charge. A new oversight board was created to investigate complaints against judges and prosecutors, and perhaps most importantly, new laws were passed requiring that all interrogations be recorded and that suspects have access to legal counsel from the moment of their arrest. These changes didn't happen without resistance. Some established officials resented having their methods questioned. Certain wealthy individuals who had benefited from the old system of corruption tried to undermine the reforms through political pressure and media campaigns. But President Traore had built something powerful: public support for justice reform that transcended political lines. Citizens had seen with their own eyes what corruption looked like, and they had also seen what was possible when leaders were committed to doing the right thing. Polls consistently showed that over 80% of the population supported the reform efforts, making it politically impossible for opponents to roll back the changes. On the third anniversary of his release from prison, Emmanuel stood before the National Assembly of Burkina Faso to deliver a speech about the progress of justice reform. Looking out at the assembled legislators, cabinet ministers, and diplomatic representatives, he reflected on how much had changed, not just for him personally, but for the entire country. 3 years ago, he began, I was a forgotten man in a forgotten cell. I had no voice, no power, no hope. Today I stand before you not because I am special, but because someone chose to listen when I had almost given up on being heard. He spoke about the hundreds of wrongfully convicted prisoners who had been freed, the families reunited, the corrupt officials held accountable, but he also spoke about the work that remained to be done. "We have made great progress, but we cannot become complacent. Justice is not a destination we reach once and then forget about. It is a commitment we must renew every day, with every decision, in every courtroom and police station and government office throughout our country." The speech was broadcast live on radio and television throughout Burkina Faso and picked up by news services across Africa. International observers noted that a former prisoner addressing a national legislature about justice reform was unprecedented on the continent and perhaps anywhere in the world. After the speech, President Traore joined Emmanuel on the steps of the National Assembly. Together, they watched as hundreds of citizens gathered in the square below, many holding signs with messages of support for the justice reforms. "Do you ever regret it?" the president asked quietly. "Taking on this fight, reliving your trauma over and over again?" Emmanuel considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted. "There are nights when I wake up thinking I'm still in that cell. There are moments when I meet a wrongfully convicted prisoner and I see my own despair reflected in their eyes, and it's almost too much to bear." He paused, watching a group of children in the square below who were playing games while their parents listened to speeches about justice reform. But then I remember that every person we free gets to see their children grow up. Every corrupt official we prosecute can't destroy another innocent life. Every reform we implement protects someone who doesn't even know they need protecting yet. How could I regret being part of that? Word of Burkina Faso's justice reforms had begun to spread throughout West Africa and beyond. Delegations from neighboring countries arrived regularly to study the methods being used and to meet with Emmanuel, whose personal story had become legendary throughout the region. A group of lawyers from Ghana spent 2 weeks observing the legal aid clinics and the prisoner review process. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable," their leader, Kofi Asante, told Emmanuel during their final meeting. "But how do we convince our government to undertake something similar? The political costs seem enormous." Emmanuel smiled. "The political costs of maintaining injustice are even greater, though they're often hidden. When people lose faith in their justice system, when they believe that only the wealthy can get fair treatment, it undermines the entire foundation of society." He pulled out a thick folder from his desk. "These are letters I've received from prisoners throughout West Africa, men and women who heard about our reforms and dared to hope that someone might listen to their stories too. The demand for justice isn't unique to Burkina Faso, it's universal. The question is whether leaders are brave enough to meet that demand." The Ghanaian delegation returned home with detailed reports on the reform process, and within 6 months, Ghana had announced its own prisoner review initiative. Similar programs began appearing in Senegal, Mali, and Côte d'Ivoire, each adapted to local conditions but following the basic principles that had been developed in Burkina Faso. International human rights organizations took notice as well. Amnesty International published a comprehensive report on the Burkina Faso reforms, calling them a model for how developing nations can confront systemic injustice and build more equitable legal systems. The United Nations invited President Traore to address the General Assembly about justice reform, making him the first African leader in decades to speak to that body about domestic judicial issues. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The International Association of Former Political Prisoners, an organization Emmanuel had never heard of during his own imprisonment, awarded him their annual Human Rights Champion Award. "Emmanuel Kabore represents the best of what we hope former prisoners can become," the organization's president said during the ceremony in Geneva. Rather than allowing bitterness to consume him, he has channeled his experience into a force for positive change that extends far beyond his own country's borders. Emmanuel accepted the award on behalf of all the people who had worked to make the reforms possible. "I am not here as an individual hero," he said in his acceptance speech. "I am here as a representative of everyone who refused to accept that injustice was inevitable. The real heroes are the judges who chose integrity over corruption, the police officers who learned to investigate rather than coerce, the lawyers who defended the poor, and the citizens who demanded better from their government." While Emmanuel's public work continued to gain international attention, his personal journey of healing was more private and perhaps more difficult. The trauma of 7 years of wrongful imprisonment couldn't be erased by recognition or professional success, no matter how meaningful that work was. Dr. Aminata Traore continued to work with Emmanuel, helping him process not just his own experiences, but also the secondary trauma that came from hearing hundreds of similar stories through his reform work. "You've taken on an enormous burden," she observed during one of their sessions. "Every wrongfully convicted prisoner you meet, every story of injustice you hear, you're carrying all of that emotional weight along with your own history." "I know," Emmanuel nodded. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in other people's pain. But then I think about what it was like when no one was listening to my pain, and I know I can't stop." "You don't have to stop," Dr. Traore replied, "but you do need to find ways to protect your own mental health while you do this work. Have you thought about reconnecting with your own family?" It was a question Emmanuel had been avoiding for 3 years. His wife had divorced him while he was in prison and had taken his 2 children to live with her family in a rural village. He had received no communication from them since his release, despite the extensive media coverage of his story. "I don't know if they want to see me," Emmanuel admitted. 7 years is a long time. My children probably don't even remember me. And my ex-wife? She moved on with her life. She had to. I can't blame her for that." "But you'll never know unless you try," Dr. Traore suggested gently. "What's the worst that could happen?" "They could reject me," Emmanuel said quietly. "They could confirm that the person I was before prison no longer exists, that 7 years of injustice didn't just steal my freedom, it stole my family forever." Despite his fears, Emmanuel eventually decided to make the journey to his ex-wife's village. He traveled alone, without the usual government security detail, driving a simple car on dusty rural roads that led away from the capital and into the countryside where he had grown up. The village of Rio was exactly as he remembered it. Small mud brick houses, children playing in dusty courtyards, old men sitting under mango trees discussing politics and crops. But as his car entered the village, he could see people stopping their activities to stare. Word of his arrival spread quickly through the small community. His ex-wife, Salamata, was working in her family's compound when she heard the commotion outside. When she looked up and saw Emmanuel walking towards her, she froze. He was thinner than she remembered, older-looking, despite being only in his mid-30s, but unmistakably the man she had married 15 years earlier. "Salamata," he said softly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I hope I'm not intruding." She studied his face for a long moment before responding. "You're not intruding. This is your village too." Their 2 children, now 12 and 14, emerged from the house cautiously. They recognized him from television and newspaper coverage, but seeing their father in person was different. The younger child, Fatima, had only been 5 when Emmanuel was arrested. She had only fragmentary memories of him. The older child, Ibrahim, had been 7 and remembered more. But 7 years of being told his father was a criminal, followed by 3 years of learning his father was innocent and famous, had left him confused about what to feel. "Papa," Ibrahim said uncertainly. Emmanuel knelt down so he was at eye level with his children. "I know this is strange for you. I know I've been gone for a very long time, and I know my being gone hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me or to love me just because I'm here now. But I want you to know that not a single day passed in prison when I didn't think about you both." Fatima stepped forward first, her natural childhood curiosity overcoming her shyness. "Are you really innocent, Papa, like they say on the radio?" "Yes, sweetheart, I was wrongly accused. I never stole anything." "Then why didn't you come home sooner?" The simple question from his daughter cut deeper than any sophisticated interrogation. "Because sometimes the system makes mistakes, and it takes time to fix them. But I never stopped trying to come home to you." The reunion was emotional but complicated. Salamata had remarried, and while her new husband was understanding about Emmanuel's visit, the situation was awkward for everyone involved. The children were curious about their father, but uncertain about what role he should play in their lives now. Emmanuel stayed in the village for 3 days, sleeping in a guest room at Salamata's brother's house and spending time with his children during the day. They walked around the village together, visited the school where they studied, and talked about their dreams for the future. On his final evening, Salamata asked to speak with him privately. "I need you to understand something," she said, as they sat under the stars behind her family's compound. "When you were arrested, I believed you were innocent, but as months turned into years with no word, no trial, no hope, I had to make a choice. I had to think about our children's future." "I understand," Emmanuel replied. "I never blamed you for moving on with your life. You did what you had to do to survive and to protect our children. I want them to know their father, but I also need to protect the stability they have now. Can we find a way for you to be part of their lives without disrupting everything we've built?" Emmanuel nodded. "All I want is to be whatever kind of father they need me to be. If that means visiting occasionally and being a friend they can talk to, that's enough. If it means more, that's wonderful, but I won't force anything." They agreed that Emmanuel would visit once a month and that the children could call him whenever they wanted. It wasn't the family reunion he had dreamed about during his years in prison, but it was real and honest and based on what was best for everyone involved. As Emmanuel's reform work entered his 4th year, the changes in Burkina Faso's justice system had become institutionalized. What had begun as Operation Justice Light had evolved into permanent structures and procedures that would outlast any individual administration. The Justice Review Commission had become a permanent government body, tasked with regularly auditing the prison system and investigating claims of wrongful conviction. Legal aid clinics operated in every region of the country, funded by both government resources and international donations. Most importantly, a new generation of judges, prosecutors, and police officers had been trained in reformed procedures that prioritized truth-finding over case closing. President Traore, now in his 2nd term, often reflected on how the changes had exceeded his original expectations. What had started as a single spontaneous prison visit had become a comprehensive transformation of how justice was administered in Burkina Faso. "We didn't just fix a broken system," he told Emmanuel during one of their regular meetings. "We created a new culture around justice. Young people growing up today will expect fair treatment from their legal system because they've seen that it's possible." Emmanuel had been thinking about his own future as well. While his work with prisoners and justice reform would always be important to him, he had begun to consider other ways he could contribute to his country's development. "I've been thinking about education," he told the president. "One of the things that made me vulnerable to false accusations was my lack of understanding about legal rights. If more citizens understood the justice system, they'd be better able to protect themselves and hold officials accountable." The conversation led to the creation of the Citizen Justice Education Program, with Emmanuel as its director. The program sent teams throughout the country to teach people about their constitutional rights, proper police procedures, and how to access legal help when needed. The program was particularly focused on rural communities and marginalized populations who had historically been most vulnerable to abuse by the justice system. Emmanuel often led these training sessions himself, sharing his own story as an example of why legal knowledge was so important. During one such session in a remote village near the border with Mali, an elderly farmer stood up during the question period. "Mr. Emmanuel," the man said, "what you have taught us today about our rights, if we had known these things when we were young, how different our lives might have been. My brother was taken by the police 30 years ago, accused of stealing cattle. We never saw him again. We didn't know we could ask for a lawyer or demand a trial. We just accepted that powerful people could do whatever they wanted to poor people like us." Emmanuel nodded solemnly. "That's exactly why we do this work. We can't change the past, but we can make sure the next generation has the knowledge to protect itself." After the session, the elderly farmer approached Emmanuel privately. "There's something else," he said. "We heard rumors that my brother might still be alive, still in prison somewhere. After all these years, is it possible?" It was a question Emmanuel heard regularly in his travels. The success of the prisoner review process had given hope to families throughout the country who had lost loved ones to the justice system decades earlier. "Give me his name and any information you have," Emmanuel said, pulling out his notebook. "We'll look into it." 3 months later, Emmanuel had extraordinary news for the old farmer. His brother was indeed still alive, imprisoned in a facility in northern Burkina Faso for the past 30 years. The original case file had been lost, but there was no record of a trial ever taking place. He had just been forgotten in the system, assumed dead by his family, and ignored by authorities. The brother's release became national news, highlighting how the justice reforms were still uncovering injustices from decades past. But for Emmanuel, the most meaningful moment came when the two elderly brothers embraced after 30 years of separation. "This is why we can never stop," Emmanuel told the television cameras covering the reunion. "Every wrongfully imprisoned person represents not just an individual injustice, but a family torn apart, a community wounded, a society that has failed to live up to its highest values." As this story draws toward its conclusion, it's important to note that the work Emmanuel and President Traore began continues to this day. Justice reform is not a project with a clear endpoint, but an ongoing commitment that requires constant vigilance and renewal. The statistics from Burkina Faso's transformation are remarkable. Over 1,200 wrongfully convicted prisoners freed, more than 150 corrupt officials prosecuted, a 70% reduction in prison overcrowding, and a dramatic increase in public confidence in the justice system. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real measure of success is in the changed lives. Children who got to grow up with fathers who were freed from wrongful imprisonment, families reunited after decades of separation, communities that learned to demand accountability from their leaders, and a new generation of legal professionals committed to justice over convenience. Emmanuel, now in his early 40s, has become one of the most respected voices on criminal justice reform in Africa. He travels regularly to other countries to share Burkina Faso's experiences and to learn from reform efforts elsewhere. But he always returns home, to the small office next to the president's, where he continues to review cases and advocate for the forgotten. His relationship with his children has grown stronger over the years. Ibrahim, now 18, has decided to study law inspired by his father's work. "I want to be a defense lawyer," he told Emmanuel during a recent visit. "I want to help people who can't help themselves, just like you do." Fatima, now 16, is more interested in journalism. "I want to tell stories about people like you, Papa," she said, "stories that show how one person can make a difference." Emmanuel's work has also brought unexpected personal healing. While he and Salamata never reconciled as husband and wife, they have built a strong friendship based on their shared commitment to their children's well-being. And perhaps most surprisingly, Emmanuel has found love again with Dr. Aminata Traore, the counselor who helped him heal from his trauma. Their relationship grew slowly from professional respect to personal affection, built on a deep understanding of trauma, healing, and the possibility of redemption. On a recent morning in Ouagadougou, as the sun rose over the capital city of Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traore and Emmanuel Kabore stood together in the courtyard of what was once Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility. The prison had been transformed into a justice education center, where citizens could learn about their rights and where legal professionals received ongoing training in ethical practices. The small cell where Emmanuel had spent 7 years of his life had been preserved as a memorial, with a plaque that read, "In memory of all who have suffered wrongful imprisonment, and in hope that justice will always triumph over injustice." "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't decided to visit the prison that day?" President Traore asked. Emmanuel considered the question carefully. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "but I've learned that life is shaped not just by the things that happen to us, but how we respond to what happens to us. Even if you hadn't come, I believe justice would have found a way. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe it would have come through someone else, but truth has a way of surfacing eventually." He paused, looking at the memorial plaque. "What I'm most grateful for is not just that I was freed, but that my experience became a catalyst for helping others. That's the real miracle, not that one wrongfully convicted man was released, but that his release led to freedom for so many others." As they prepared to leave the memorial site, a young woman approached them. She was carrying a folder and looked nervous but determined. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Emmanuel Traore?" "Yes, I am. My name is Marie Ouedraogo. My father has been in prison for 12 years. I've read about your work, and I was hoping you might be able to help." Emmanuel smiled and accepted the folder she offered. "Tell me about your father's case." And so the work continues. Every day brings new stories, new injustices to investigate, new lives to be potentially transformed. The justice reforms initiated by President Traore and championed by Emmanuel Traore have become a permanent part of Burkina Faso's legal landscape, but they require constant attention and advocacy to maintain their effectiveness. Emmanuel often tells people that his 7 years in prison were the worst experience of his life, but also the experience that gave his life its deepest meaning. "I wouldn't wish wrongful imprisonment on anyone," he says, "but I'm grateful that my suffering led to something larger than myself." Today, throughout West Africa and beyond, the story of Emmanuel and President Traore is told as an example of how individual courage and institutional commitment can create transformative change. It's a story about the power of listening to forgotten voices, the importance of believing in justice even when systems fail, and the possibility that one person's fight for freedom can light the way for countless others. The chains have been broken, the truth has been told, and the light of justice continues to shine, not just in Burkina Faso, but wherever people refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable or unimportant. In a world often filled with stories of corruption, oppression, and despair, the transformation of Burkina Faso's justice system stands as proof that change is possible, that leaders can choose to serve justice over convenience, and that sometimes the most powerful voice for reform comes from those who have suffered most under the old system. Emmanuel Traore, once a forgotten man in a forgotten cell, became the voice that helped transform a nation's understanding of justice. His story reminds us that every person behind bars, every voice crying out for fairness, every plea for help deserves to be heard. Because in the end, justice is not just about laws and courts and procedures, it's about seeing the humanity in every person, listening to the unheard, and never accepting that some people's suffering is inevitable or unimportant. The work continues, the light shines on, and somewhere, right now, another forgotten person is waiting for someone to listen, to believe, and to act. That person could be anywhere. That someone who listens could be anyone. The question is, will we have the courage to hear them when they call? This story of justice, redemption, and transformation in Burkina Faso serves as both inspiration and challenge, a reminder that the fight for justice never ends, but also that victory is always possible when people of courage choose to stand up for what is right.